The old Chevrolet pickup truck wheezed to a stop beside the crumbling gas pumps, its engine ticking like a dying clock in the desert heat. James Vance sat behind the wheel for a long moment, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel as if it might keep him anchored to something real. Through the cracked windshield, he surveyed his inheritance. 2 rust-eaten pumps that hadn't dispensed fuel in a decade. A service station with boards nailed over half its windows, and an expanse of cracked concrete that stretched toward the empty highway like a graveyard of better days. The German Shepherd was already there, sitting precisely where the property line met the road. As if he'd been waiting. His coat was the color of burnt wheat and shadow, and his eyes held an intelligence that made James uncomfortable. The dog didn't bark, didn't move. Just watched as James finally stepped out of the truck. His left leg stiff from the shrapnel that still worked its way through muscle when the weather changed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the abandoned station. And James could smell the decay of it all. Motor oil soaked so deep into the concrete, it had become part of the earth, rust eating through metal, and something else. Something that reminded him too much of the abandoned outposts outside Kandahar. He'd inherited this place from a father who'd spoken to him exactly twice in the last 15 years, and now Colonel Grant Vance was dead, leaving behind this monument to failure and a dog James didn't want. Max, that's what the lawyer had called the dog, rose slowly and padded toward the station's entrance, stopping at a particular spot where the concrete had spider-webbed into a complex pattern of cracks. The dog lowered his massive head and sniffed at the fracture, then sat down again, his body rigid with attention. James watched, transfixed by the animal's focus, the way his ears swiveled forward and his tail went perfectly still. "Nothing there but broken dreams, boy," James muttered, but his voice caught in his throat. The dog turned to look at him, and in that moment, James felt something shift in his chest. A premonition, maybe, or just the kind of paranoia that comes from too many nights sleeping with one eye open. The station held secrets. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he'd felt IEDs buried beneath innocent-looking dirt roads. And this dog, this creature his father had loved more than his own sons, seemed to know exactly where those secrets were buried. James didn't know it yet. But beneath his feet lay $200 million. And a truth that would either save him or get him killed. The dog knew, though. Max had been waiting, guarding, keeping watch over something that mattered more than money. He'd been waiting for James to come home. Even if James didn't know this place had ever been home at all. 3 weeks earlier, James had been drinking himself into oblivion in a 1-bedroom apartment in Tucson, the kind of place where the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor's dreams dying. The bottle of whiskey on his kitchen table was half empty, or half full if you were the kind of person who still believed in optimism, which James decidedly was not. The television droned in the background, some nature documentary about wolves, but all James could see was Private First Class Ryan Torres, 22 years old, bleeding out in his arms, while the medic screamed for a helicopter that would arrive 7 minutes too late. The phone rang 4 times before James realized it wasn't part of his whiskey-induced haze. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, the kind that delivered bad news for a living. "Mr. Vance, this is Harrison Whitfield from Whitfield & Associates. I'm calling about your father's estate." James had laughed then, a bitter sound that made the lawyer pause. "The colonel didn't have a son," James said. "He had disappointments, but Grant Vance was dead, heart attack at his desk, still in uniform even though he'd been retired for 3 years. The funeral had been everything the colonel would have wanted. Full military honors, a 21-gun salute, and both of James's siblings in their finest clothes, playing the part of the grieving children. Caleb wore a suit that probably cost more than James made in 6 months, his real estate empire having made him rich enough to buy respect if not earn it. Isabel stood beside him, her pharmaceutical company blazer impeccable, her tears perfectly timed for the photographers from the local paper. James had stood in the back, his sole decent shirt straining against shoulders that had carried too much for too long. He'd left before the reception, but not before the lawyer caught him, pressing a business card into his hand with instructions to come to the reading of the will. The law office smelled like leather and old money, the kind of place where decisions were made that affected people who would never be allowed through the front door. Caleb sprawled in his chair like he owned the place, which he probably could have. Isabel sat with perfect posture, her phone buzzing with what she called urgent business matters every few minutes. James stood by the window, watching the normal people walk by on the street below, living their normal lives. To my eldest son, Caleb, the lawyer read, "I leave my investment portfolio and the house in Scottsdale." Caleb's grin was sharp enough to cut glass. To my daughter, Isabel, the offshore accounts and mother's jewelry collection. Isabel nodded, satisfied, already calculating values in her head. To my youngest son, James. The lawyer paused, adjusted his glasses. "I leave the service station on Highway 86, and my dog, Max." The silence that followed was perfect, crystalline, the kind that comes right before an explosion. Then Caleb laughed. Loud and harsh. "A gas station? A defunct, worthless gas station and a mutt?" He turned to James, his eyes glittering with decades of resentment. "Perfect. The family failure gets the junk. Even dead. The old man knew exactly what you're worth." Isabel's smile was more subtle but no less cruel. "At least the dog might keep you company while you drink yourself to death." James had walked out without a word, but their laughter followed him all the way to his truck. He'd driven to the station that very day, partly to escape their voices, partly because he had nowhere else to go. The eviction notice on his apartment door had made that decision for him. The Colonel's final insult. A. Abandoned gas station 70 miles from nowhere. And a dog to watch him fail. But now, standing in the ruins of the station with Max watching him with those unsettling eyes, James wondered if the joke was on someone else entirely. The first night at the station, James tried to pretend the dog didn't exist. He'd found an old cot in the back office, probably left over from when the place actually functioned, and set up his meager possessions. A duffel bag of clothes, his father's folded flag from the funeral, and 3 bottles of whiskey he'd been saving for the right kind of wrong night. This seemed to qualify. Max sat in the doorway, his bulk filling the frame, those amber eyes never leaving James's face. When James uncapped the first bottle, the dog's ears flattened against his skull. When James raised it to his lips, Max moved, fluid and fast for such a large animal, his jaws closing gently but firmly around James's wrist. "Get off me," James snarled, but Max held on, not hurting, just preventing. Their eyes met, and James saw something in the dog's gaze that stopped him cold. Recognition. Understanding. The kind of look that said, "I know where you've been, and I know where you're going if you drink that." James yanked his arm free, the bottle dropping, whiskey spreading across the floor like blood. The smell of it triggered something. And suddenly he was back there, in the dust and chaos. Ryan's blood mixing with the dirt, while James pressed his hands against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. The IED had been buried in a spot they'd cleared the day before. Someone had watched them, waited, planned. Ryan had been talking about his girlfriend back home, showing James a picture on his phone when the world exploded. "We've got you, brother." James had lied, feeling Ryan's life pump out between his fingers. "Medic's coming. You're going home." But Ryan knew. His eyes, young and terrified, and somehow still trusting, locked on James's face. "Tell her I loved her," he'd whispered. "Tell her I was thinking about her." James came back to himself on his knees in the gas station. Max pressed against his side, the dog's weight keeping him grounded in the present. His hands were shaking, and he realized he was crying. Great, gasping sobs that felt like they were tearing him apart from the inside. Max didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stayed there, solid and warm and real. When the storm passed, James found himself with his arms around the dog's neck, face buried in that thick fur that smelled like dust and loyalty. "I couldn't save him," he whispered. "I couldn't save any of them." Max turned his head, his tongue rough against James's face. And somehow, that simple gesture said more than any words could have. From that moment, they were no longer strangers. They were 2 soldiers who'd seen too much, lost too much, and somehow found each other in the wreckage. Days passed in a routine that felt almost like peace. James began cleaning the station, not because he had any plans for it, but because the work kept his hands busy and his mind focused. Max shadowed him everywhere. And James found himself talking to the dog, telling him things he'd never told another living soul. About the missions that went wrong, about the friends who didn't come home, about the father who'd looked at him like a stranger even before he'd enlisted. It was on the 4th day that Max began acting strange. The dog kept returning to that same spot near the entrance, pawing at the cracked concrete, whining low in his throat. James ignored it at first, but Max became insistent, barking sharp and urgent, then racing back to James and tugging at his sleeve with his teeth. "What is it, boy?" James finally asked, following the dog to the spot. The cracks in the concrete formed an almost perfect square, and when James knelt down, he could see that the edges weren't random breaks but clean cuts, painted over to look like natural wear. His heart began to pound as he retrieved a crowbar from the station's tool closet. The concrete square lifted away to reveal a metal handle set into a reinforced steel plate. James pulled, and a section of the floor rose on hidden hinges, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Max barked once, triumphant, his tail wagging for the first time since James had met him. The beam of James's flashlight cut through the darkness below, illuminating what looked like a military footlocker. Pristine, despite what must have been years underground. His hands trembled as he climbed down. Max, watching from above, standing guard. The footlocker wasn't locked, and when James opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Dog tags, not his father's but older, from Vietnam. A photograph, faded but still clear, of his mother, young and laughing, standing next to a man in uniform James didn't recognize. A journal, leather-bound, and filled with his father's precise handwriting, but in code. The kind of cipher James had learned during ranger training. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a brass key unlike anything James had ever seen, its head shaped like a gear with teeth that seemed to form a pattern. A message in themselves. James sat in the darkness beneath the station. The contents of the footlocker spread before him and began to decode his father's journal. The first entry was dated 3 months before the colonel's death. "If you're reading this, James, then you found Max, and Max found you. Everything I couldn't say, everything I couldn't be, it's all here. The station is more than it seems. I pray you're still the man I knew you could be, despite everything I did to break you. The key opens the real inheritance. Trust Max. He knows the way." James climbed back into the fading daylight, the key heavy in his pocket, the journal clutched against his chest. Max was already moving, heading toward the back of the station where an old Coca-Cola vending machine stood against the wall, its paint peeling, its glass front cracked. The dog sat down in front of it and looked back at James, waiting. The vending machine hadn't worked in decades, but when James examined it closely, he found what he was looking for, a small keyhole hidden behind the coin return. The brass key slid in perfectly, and with a click that seemed to echo through James's bones, the entire machine swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a modern steel door with an electronic keypad. The code was in the journal, hidden in what looked like supply requisition numbers. James entered it with steady fingers, and the door opened with a soft hiss of pressurized air. Beyond was an elevator, military grade, the kind used in classified facilities. Max entered first, as if he'd done this 100 times before, and James followed, his heart pounding as the elevator descended far deeper than any gas station basement had a right to go. The doors opened onto a corridor lit by LED strips. The walls, reinforced concrete painted military gray. At the end of the corridor was another door, this one marked with the seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency and the words Outpost 77 Alpha. James's father hadn't just been a colonel. He'd been something more, something secret, and he'd been running operations from beneath a gas station in the middle of nowhere. The main room beyond the door was a command center frozen in time but still humming with power. Computer screens lined one wall, and though the technology was a few years out of date, everything was functional, waiting. A desk dominated the center of the room, and on it was a single envelope with James's name written in his father's hand. But it was the screen on the far wall that drew James's attention. It flickered to life as he entered, motion sensors still operational, and his father's face appeared. Recorded who knew how long ago. The colonel looked older than James remembered, tired, but his eyes were clear and focused. "James," the recording began, and hearing his father say his name without disappointment in his voice made James's throat tight. "If you're watching this, then I'm dead. And you've found your way here with Max's help. I know you hate me. You have every right to. I pushed you away because I had to, because the work I did here required absolute secrecy, even from family. Especially from family." The colonel paused, seemed to gather himself. "For 32 years, I ran intelligence operations from this outpost. Officially, I was retired. Unofficially, I was tracking arms dealers, terrorist financing, and threats to national security that operated in the shadows between legal and illegal. The money I made, yes, James, I made money. A lot of it came from legal investments, based on intelligence that was going to be public anyway. Not insider trading, but close enough to make me rich and fund operations Congress wouldn't approve. The recording shifted, showing financial documents, account numbers, investment portfolios. $200 million, James. All legal, all clean, all yours. Not Caleb's, not Isabel's. Yours, because you're the only one I trust with it. Your brother is dirty, James. He's been selling information to arms dealers for years. Your sister launders money for them through her pharmaceutical company. They think they're so clever, but I have evidence of everything stored in this facility. James sank into the desk chair, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. Max came to his side, resting his great head on James's knee. I know about Ryan Torres, the recording continued, and James's blood turned to ice. I know about the IED that killed him and your other men. What you don't know is who funded that terrorist cell. The money came through a network of shell companies that trace back to your siblings. They didn't know, of course. They didn't care where the money went, as long as they got their cut. But Ryan died because of their greed. The recording paused, and when the colonel spoke again, his voice was softer. I failed you as a father. I was so busy saving the world that I couldn't save my own son. But you saved yourself, James. You became the man I always hoped you'd be, even without my help, maybe because of the lack of it. The money, this facility, the evidence, it's all yours. There's a handler, Agent Sarah Reed. She'll contact you when you're ready. Use it all to do what I couldn't. Be a better man than your father. The screen went dark, and James sat in the silence of the bunker, Max solid beside him. Above them, the abandoned gas station sat like a facade, hiding truths that could destroy his family and save his soul. James reached for the envelope on the desk, opened it with steady hands. Inside was a single photo. His father and Max, taken maybe a year ago, both of them looking at the camera with the same serious expression. On the back, in his father's writing, Max saved my life, more times than I can count. Now, it's his turn to save yours. James looked down at the dog, who looked back with those knowing amber eyes. Okay, boy, he said quietly. Let's see what the old man left us to work with. The decision to stop drinking wasn't dramatic. James simply poured the remaining bottles of whiskey down the old sink in the station's bathroom and watched them disappear into the desert earth. Max watched from the doorway, approval clear in his posture. The withdrawal was hard, 3 days of shakes and sweats and nightmares, but Max never left his side, and somehow that made it bearable. On the 4th day, James woke clear-headed for the first time in 2 years. That clarity would prove essential for what came next. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a black Mercedes that pulled up to the station on a Tuesday afternoon. Caleb stepped out, his Italian shoes immediately covered in dust. His expression one of barely contained disgust. Isabel emerged from the passenger side, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly about shipment delays and customs issues. James, Caleb said, his smile sharp as broken glass. Enjoying your inheritance? It's peaceful, James replied. Standing in the doorway of the station, Max alert beside him. Peaceful, Isabel repeated, ending her call. That's one word for it. Worthless is another. What do you want? James asked, though he already knew. We want to help you, Caleb said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false generosity. This place is a burden, James. Let us take it off your hands. I have developers interested in the land. We could get you maybe 50,000, enough to start over somewhere else. Not interested. Isabel's eyes narrowed. Don't be stupid, James. You can't live here forever, playing desert hermit with that mongrel. Max growled, low and warning. James placed a hand on the dog's head, calming him. The station's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Caleb said, his friendly mask slipping. Just a matter of price. They left, but James knew they'd be back. He spent that night in the bunker, reviewing his father's files, learning the extent of his siblings' crimes. Arms dealing, money laundering, connections to terrorist cells in 7 countries. The evidence was meticulous, overwhelming, damning. His father had been building these cases for years, waiting for the right moment. Or the right person. 3 nights later, they came. James woke to Max's urgent barking. The dog already at the window, hackles raised. Through the glass, James could see 3 figures in black moving across the property. Professional, coordinated. These weren't common thieves. James's ranger training kicked in before conscious thought. He grabbed the Glock his father had left in the bunker, checked the magazine, chambered around. Max was already at the door, ready, trained for this moment. They came through the front door, expecting to find a drunk veteran easy to subdue. Instead, they found a ranger with home field advantage and a military working dog with years of training. The fight was brief, violent, and decisive. James moved through the darkness like he'd been born to it, muscle memory taking over. Max was a shadow with teeth, taking down one intruder with trained precision. When the last attacker fled into the night, James stood in the wreckage of the station's front room, breathing hard. Blood from a gash on his arm, dripping onto the floor. The 2 intruders who hadn't escaped were zip-tied and unconscious. In one's pocket, James found a phone with recent calls to a number he recognized from his father's files, Caleb's private line. "They weren't here for the station," James said to Max, who was standing guard over the captives. "They were here for what's underneath it." The next morning, as James was still deciding what to do with his captives, a plain sedan pulled up to the station. The woman who stepped out was everything his siblings weren't. Understated, professional, dangerous, in a quiet way. She showed her credentials before James could draw his weapon. "Agent Sarah Reed, DIA, she said, her eyes taking in the scene, the zip-tied men visible through the window. "Your father said you'd eventually need my help." They sat in the bunker, Reed reviewing the files, while James watched her face for any sign of what she was thinking. Max lay between them, apparently familiar with Reed, which said more than any credentials could. "Your father was building this case for 7 years, Reed finally said. "We knew about Caleb and Isabel, but we needed the evidence he gathered. Evidence that's now yours. How deep does this go?" James asked. Reed's expression was grim. "Your brother's network supplied weapons to 14 terrorist organizations. Your sister's pharmaceutical company laundered nearly $1 billion in blood money. The cell that killed Private Torres? They bought their weapons through Caleb's contacts, paid for with money Isabel cleaned." James felt the rage rising, hot and pure, but also something else. Purpose. For the first time since Ryan died, he had a mission that mattered. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Everything," Reed said simply. "The files, the recordings, your testimony. In return, we protect you, and when this is over, the money your father left is yours, clean and clear. And my siblings will spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, if they're lucky." James looked at Max, who looked back with those steady amber eyes. The dog had saved him from the bottle, saved him from the attackers, saved him from himself. Now it was time to return the favor, to honor the trust his father had placed in both of them. "When do we start?" James asked. Reed smiled, the expression sharp and satisfied. "How about now?" The plan required James to appear vulnerable, to let his guard down in a way that would draw Caleb and Isabel out. Reed's team would be watching, recording, waiting for the siblings to incriminate themselves fully. James's job was to be bait, a role he'd played before in Afghanistan, though never with stakes this personal. It happened faster than expected. 3 days after Reed's visit, James woke to find Max gone. The door to the station was open, and in the dirt outside was a clear sign of struggle. Drag marks, a dart with tranquilizer residue. Max's collar torn off and lying in the dust. On the station's door, pinned with a knife, was a note in Caleb's handwriting. "The old lumber mill. Midnight. Bring the journals and whatever else the old man left you, or we put the dog down." James's hands shook as he called Reed. "They have Max. We're tracking this," Reed said, her voice calm but urgent. "My team can be at the mill in 30 minutes. I'm going now." "James, wait." But James had already hung up. This wasn't about evidence anymore. This was about Max, who'd saved his life, who'd been his only friend in the darkness. Rangers don't leave anyone behind. And James wasn't about to start now. The abandoned lumber mill squatted against the night sky like a diseased giant, its broken windows gleaming with reflected moonlight. James parked his truck a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, his father's Glock tucked into his waistband, a combat knife in his boot. He could hear Max barking, the sound echoing through the empty structures, and his blood burned with the need to get to his friend. The main building was lit by harsh work lights that threw dramatic shadows across the rotting machinery. Caleb stood in the center of the space, designer clothes incongruous in the industrial decay. Isabel was beside him, holding a chrome-plated pistol, with the awkwardness of someone who'd taken lessons but never faced real danger. Behind them, in a cage meant for much smaller animals, Max was crammed in, his eyes finding James immediately. "You came," Caleb said, his smile triumphant. "I knew you would. You always were predictable." "Little brother, let him go," James said, stepping into the light. "This is between us." "No," Isabel said, her voice cold. "This is about money. Father left you something, didn't he? Something more than that worthless station." James pulled the journal from his jacket, held it up. "This is what you want? Dad's old writings?" Caleb's eyes glittered with greed. "Don't play dumb, James. We know about the bunker. We know about the accounts. Did you really think we'd let you keep $200 million? Money you earned selling weapons to terrorists," James said quietly. "Money you washed through pharmaceutical fronts, while soldiers died from bombs bought with your profits." Isabel laughed. The sound, like breaking crystal. "Spare us the righteousness. You killed plenty of people in your war. I killed enemies. You killed Ryan Torres." The name hung in the air like an accusation. Caleb shrugged. "Who?" "My best friend. Killed by an IED funded through your network. Collateral damage," Caleb said dismissively. "Cost of doing business." That's when James heard them. Vehicles approaching. No lights. No sirens. Reed's team. Moving into position. He just had to keep his siblings talking. Keep them focused on him. "You want the money?" James asked, moving closer, the journal extended. "Take it. But let Max go first. The dog stays until we have everything," Isabel said, raising the pistol. "The journal, the evidence, the account numbers, all of it." James saw the red laser dots appear on the wall behind his siblings, multiplying like deadly stars. Reed's snipers were in position, but Caleb saw James's eyes track the movement, and his face twisted with understanding. "You brought them," he snarled, reaching for his own weapon. Everything happened at once. The skylights shattered as tactical teams rappelled in. Isabel screamed and fired wildly. Caleb dove behind a rusted saw blade, and James moved, not for cover but for Max's cage, even as bullets sparked off the metal around him. The lock was a simple padlock, and James shot it off without hesitation. Max burst from the cage like fury incarnate, launching himself at an attacker James hadn't even seen approaching from his blind spot. The mill became a battlefield. Agents swarming in, his siblings' hired guns fighting desperately. James found himself face to face with Caleb in the chaos, his brother's perfect face twisted with rage and fear. "You destroyed everything," Caleb spat. "For what? A dog? A dead friend?" "For Ryan," James said. "For all of them." Caleb raised his gun, but Max was faster, hitting him from the side, jaws clamping on his gun arm. Caleb's scream was high and terrified, the sound of a man who'd never faced anything he couldn't buy his way out of. When the smoke cleared, when the last shot had been fired, James knelt in the sawdust, with his arms around Max, checking the dog for injuries, whispering apologies, and thanks in equal measure. Around them, agents were loading his siblings into vehicles, reading them rights they'd never thought would apply to them. Reed approached, her tactical vest dusty but her expression satisfied. "You did good, James. Your father would be proud." James looked at her, then at Max, whose tail was wagging despite everything. "He saved me," James said simply. Just like the colonel knew he would. 6 months later, the gas station was unrecognizable. Where rust and decay had ruled, now fresh paint gleamed. The pumps were gone, replaced by a small park with benches and shade trees. The station itself had been converted into a rest stop, But not just any rest stop. A sign by the road read Grant and Ryan Memorial Rest Stop, and beneath it, home of the Torres Foundation for Veterans and Service Dogs. James stood in the doorway, watching a group of children from a school field trip play with Max in the grass. The dog was patient with them, letting them pet him, teaching them through his calm presence that strength could be gentle, that warriors could heal. The foundation had been James's idea, funded with his father's money, clean now after the government had taken its share and cleared the rest. They paired veterans with service dogs, animals trained not just to assist but to understand, to guard against the demons that came in bottles and nightmares. In 6 months, they'd made 14 matches, 14 soldiers who might make it home after all. A truck pulled up, and a young veteran stepped out, his prosthetic leg evident in his careful gait. Behind him, nervous but hopeful, his wife held their daughter's hand. They were here for their dog, a German Shepherd mix named Courage that Max had helped train. "Mr. Vance," the veteran said, extending his hand. "I'm Marcus. This is Sarah and Emma." James shook his hand, noted the steadiness in it, the clear eyes. Marcus was 40 days sober, working the program, fighting for his family. "Good to meet you. Ready to meet Courage." As James led them to the kennels behind the station, Max fell into step beside him, and James felt the familiar weight of his father's final gift. Not the money, not the bunker, not even the justice that had put his siblings away for life. The gift was simpler than that. The knowledge that broken things could be made whole, that loyalty could heal what betrayal had wounded, that sometimes salvation came on 4 legs and asked for nothing more than the chance to serve. The desert wind carried the sound of children laughing, of dogs barking happily, of veterans telling stories that ended with hope instead of darkness. And somewhere, James thought, his father and Ryan were watching, satisfied that the mission, at last, was complete. The sun set over the memorial rest stop, painting the sky in shades of amber that matched Max's eyes. James sat on a bench with the dog beside him, watching the traffic pass on the highway. Each vehicle that stopped was a chance for someone to read the plaques, to learn about Ryan Torres and the others who hadn't made it home, to understand that their sacrifice had meaning beyond the battlefield. A reporter had come by the week before, wanting to write about the miracle fortune and the dramatic takedown of his siblings' criminal empire. James had declined the interview, but he'd given her one, quote, "The deepest wounds aren't healed by time or money or revenge. They're healed by loyalty so pure it asks for nothing in return, and love so simple it can be carried in the heart of a dog." Max shifted beside him, resting his great head on James's knee, and together they watched the stars emerge in the desert sky, each one a small light against the darkness, each one a promise that even in the vastness of loss, no one who is loved is ever truly alone.